There is a park in Jerusalem where people walk their dogs. It sits just outside the old city walls on the southern side, a narrow green valley running between two slopes, with wildflowers in spring, a footpath along the bottom, olive trees, and rock-cut tombs in the hillsides that people jog past without looking at. On a warm evening you can hear traffic on the road above, and children somewhere further up the hill. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. This valley is called Gei Ben-Hinnom, the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. In Hebrew that shortens to Ge-Hinnom, and when Greek speakers wrote it down, it became a word you already know, Gehenna. It is the word that appears in the Gospels roughly a dozen times in the most severe warnings ever attributed to Jesus. In almost every English Bible, it is translated with a single syllable, hell. And in Arabic, it became Jahannam, the primary word for hell in the Quran, used dozens of times. 3 of the world's great religions took the name of one ravine outside one city, a place with an address, a postcode, and a footpath, and made it the word for eternal damnation. And here is the detail that made me want to spend a night on this. In 1979, an archaeologist working on the shoulder of that same valley opened a burial chamber whose ceiling had collapsed in antiquity, which meant that, unlike almost every other tomb in the valley, the looters had never got in. Inside, among the bones and the grave goods, were 2 tiny objects of silver, rolled up tight, no bigger than the end of your thumb. When they were unrolled, a process that took 3 years, they turned out to carry the oldest surviving text of the Hebrew Bible ever found. 600 years before the Common Era, centuries older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the text on them is not a curse. It is not a warning. It is a blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you, and give you peace. The oldest words of Scripture we possess were dug out of the ground of the valley whose name became the word for hell. Remember those silver scrolls? We come back to them at the very end of the night. Because that contradiction is the whole problem. If hell is a valley in Jerusalem, where did the fire come from? Where did the pit come from? And the darkness, and the sorting of the dead, and the idea that anything at all happens to you afterwards? Because it is not in the Hebrew Bible. It genuinely is not there. The oldest layers of Scripture have no hell in them at all. Somewhere in the gap between those silver scrolls and the Gospels, someone drew the map. And the oldest surviving copy of that map is in a book that was quoted in the New Testament and then left out of almost every Bible. A book that describes the place of punishment in careful, specific, physical detail centuries before anyone wrote the word Gehenna in Greek. They built hell the way you'd build a city, one traveller's report at a time. So tonight, we go and look. What does the Book of Enoch actually say about hell? Where is the accursed valley he's shown? Because it is not underground, and the location will surprise you. What is imprisoned in the abyss where there is no earth beneath and no heaven above? And why is almost everything you picture when you hear the word hell missing from the book that invented it? Before we go any further, I want to say something about tonight. This is a long walk through an old map, and you don't need to follow every word. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the voice carry you through the rooms and the valleys and the abyss at the edge of the world. And if you drift somewhere along the way, that's exactly right. Some nights you'll fall asleep in the valley, some nights beside the holy mountain, some nights in the middle of a sentence about silver scrolls. All of it is fine. That's what the night is for. This is for the ones who want to know where an idea came from. For the ones who have heard the word hell their whole lives and never once thought to ask who first said it and what did they actually mean. For anyone who has been told something since childhood and then, years later, quietly wondered who told the first person, you are exactly who this is for. And one thing I want to say clearly, once, at the beginning, before we go anywhere. Nothing tonight is a warning. This is the history of an idea, where it came from, how it was assembled, piece by piece, over centuries, by people who were trying to make the world make sense. Nothing in what follows is directed at you. We are archaeologists tonight, not judges. One small thing, if you're listening to this and you have a moment before sleep, I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you, and what hour is it where you are? Leave it below. I read them in the mornings. Someone in a small town in Canada at 11 at night. Someone in a flat in Manchester with rain on the windows. Someone in Australia with the sun already thinking about rising. It matters to me more than I can explain, knowing where the voice goes in the dark. If tonight is useful to you, a quiet like before you sleep is always welcome. And if you'd like more nights like this one, you can subscribe. It costs nothing and it means everything. But listening and resting and walking through this old valley with me tonight, that's already more than enough. Let's begin with what is certain. The Valley of Hinnom is real, and its location has never been in dispute. If you stand on the ramparts of Jerusalem's old city, the Ottoman walls that Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt in the 16th century, following the line of far older walls beneath, and you look south and then southwest, the ground drops away. The valley runs along the base of the hill that the city stands on, a natural geological feature, a fold in the landscape that predates any wall or city by millions of years. It is not wide. At its narrowest it is perhaps 100 meters across, and even at its broadest it is not much more than that. A compressed, intimate space between two slopes. The western hill rises steeply on one side. The slope that the old city stands on rises on the other. At the eastern end, the valley meets the Kidron Valley, which runs between the city and the Mount of Olives, and the two together form the natural moat that protects the city on 3 of its sides. In the rock of those slopes, the people of the Iron Age cut their tombs. This was standard practice across the ancient Near East. The dead were laid in chambers carved into the hillside, sometimes sealed with a rolling stone, sometimes with carved facades, sometimes with nothing but the soft limestone of the hill itself. The slopes of the Hinnom Valley are riddled with these chambers. Some are explored, most are not. You walk past them on the footpath without necessarily knowing what you are walking past. The valley floor itself, where the footpath runs today, would have been used for different purposes at different times. Farming, pasture, industry, in the way that all land on the outside of ancient city walls was used. The rock above holds the dead, the valley below holds the living, going about the ordinary work of being alive in a place that has walls and a gate and a name. In the Iron Age, which in this part of the world means roughly 1200 to 586 BC, the valley was within walking distance of the capital of the Kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem sat above it on the hill. The Hinnom Valley was on the outside of the city, below the walls, which in the logic of ancient cities meant it occupied a particular kind of social space, close enough to be used, far enough to be other, separated from the enclosed world of streets and markets and temples by the boundary of the wall. That in-between character, neither city nor wilderness, neither inside nor outside, too close to be forgotten and too close to the wall to be ordinary, is part of what the valley became. Places that are liminal in this way, that sit at the threshold of the ordered world, accumulate meaning. They become the places where things that cannot happen inside the walls happen outside them, and where things that cannot be said inside the walls are said outside them. The Valley of Hinnom was that kind of place. The tombs in the slope of the Hinnom Valley are extraordinary in their variety. Some of them are simple chambers, single rooms cut into the rock, large enough for a few bodies. Others are more elaborate, multi-chambered complexes with benches along the walls, where the bodies were laid on their backs with their possessions arranged around them, and a central space that could be entered by family members bringing offerings. The rock is soft enough to cut but hard enough to preserve, and the tombs that have not been disturbed are time capsules of extraordinary completeness. The burial customs they represent are specifically Judahite, related to, but distinct from, the practices of neighboring cultures. The bodies were laid in the tomb, and after the flesh had decomposed, the bones were gathered and placed in a lower repository to make room for the next burial. This gathering of bones, a practice that may be behind the phrase "gathered to his people" that appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible to describe a death, turned each tomb into a generational archive. The bones of grandparents and grandchildren shared the same space. The repository was a kind of family archive in bone. Gabriel Barkay's excavations at Ge-Hinnom were not the first at the site. Others had worked there before him, with various degrees of care. What made Cave 24 extraordinary was precisely its inaccessibility. The collapsed ceiling that had sealed the repository and kept it from the hands of earlier visitors, whether tomb robbers or archaeologists. The ceiling fell, and in falling it became a preservation mechanism, and the preservation mechanism held for 2.5 millennia. When archaeologists speak of the serendipity of discovery, Cave 24 at Ge-Hinnom is among the canonical examples. The ceiling that made the room inaccessible was the ceiling that made the silver scrolls possible. The disaster of the collapse was the condition of the survival. And at some point during the later Iron Age, something happened in this valley that marked it for the rest of its recorded history. The texts that describe it are careful, and I want to be careful with them too, because this is a subject where the evidence and the interpretation have been tangled together for a very long time. What the ancient texts say happened here is recorded by writers who were opponents of it, which means we are reading accounts from one side of a dispute. That is not unusual in ancient history. Most of what we know about ancient religious practices comes from people who condemned them, but it means we should hold the description with appropriate care. In the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, historical texts written during or shortly after the period they describe, there are references to a place called the Topheth in the valley of the son of Hinnom. The word Topheth appears nowhere else in the ancient Near East, and its etymology is genuinely uncertain. Some scholars connect it to an Aramaic root meaning fireplace or furnace. Others have proposed different derivations, including a connection to an old word for drum. What the texts say about it, however, is less ambiguous in its condemnation, even if the precise nature of what occurred is still debated. They say that kings of Judah, specifically Ahaz in the second half of the 8th century BC, and Manasseh in the first half of the 7th, caused their sons to pass through fire in this place, an act condemned by the biblical writers as an abomination. The Assyrian records from the same period don't describe the practice in Judah specifically, and Egyptian sources are equally silent on it. So we are almost entirely dependent on these biblical texts, which are written from the perspective of reformers who considered what happened there to be among the worst of the apostasies that brought destruction on the kingdom. One thing that is documented, however, documented in detail by the same texts, is what a subsequent king did about it. Around 622 BC, during the reign of Josiah, a king remembered by the biblical writers as one of the most righteous in Judah's history, a reform was carried out across the kingdom. It was comprehensive and systematic. The high places on the hills outside Jerusalem were demolished. The altars to foreign gods were torn down. The priests who served at unauthorized shrines were removed. And the Topheth, in the valley of the son of Hinnom, was specifically and deliberately desecrated. The text says that Josiah defiled the Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire. This is not a passive neglect. This is not simply closing something down. This is a deliberate act of pollution, of rendering a place ritually unclean so that it could never again be used for sacred purposes. In the logic of the ancient Near East, a defiled place carried its defilement permanently. What Josiah did to the Topheth was the religious equivalent of salting the earth. Whether that ritual defilement involved the dumping of bones, or the slaughter of animals, or some other specific act of deliberate contamination, the texts do not specify in detail. What is clear is that from Josiah's reform onward, the valley's association in religious memory was with something wrong, something defiled, something that the people of Israel were not supposed to do and would not do again if the reform held. The valley was marked. Its name carried weight now that it had not carried before. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the decades immediately after Josiah's reform, Jeremiah was active during the final decades of the kingdom of Judah, from roughly 627 until after the Babylonian conquest of 586 BC, gave the valley another name. In the 7th chapter of the book that carries his name, he proclaimed in the voice of the God of Israel that the valley would be called the Valley of Slaughter. This is a prophecy of disaster, of the bodies of the dead lying in the open because there would be no one left to bury them, of a defeat so complete that the ordinary dignities of death could not be observed. But it is also a naming act. The valley of the son of Hinnom becomes, in prophetic language, the Valley of Slaughter. Jeremiah comes back to this valley more than once. In the 19th chapter, he is told to go to the valley of the son of Hinnom and proclaim disaster on the city and the land. He does so, smashing a clay flask to illustrate the breaking of a people. The valley is not incidental to his prophecy. It is the stage on which the prophecy is performed. You can feel the weight of that layering from where you stand now. A geological fold in the rock, millions of years old, caring nothing for human history. A place of early Iron Age religious practice, condemned by reformers. A king's deliberate act of pollution, around 622 BC. A prophet's dark renaming in the final decades of the kingdom. All of this in one small valley, 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. And then something else happened there. In 1979, on the slope called Ge-Hinnom, the shoulder of Hinnom, on the western side of the valley. Gabriel Barkay is an Israeli archaeologist who has spent much of his career excavating in and around Jerusalem, and in 1975 his team began working at Ge-Hinnom, on rock-cut tomb chambers that had been known about but not systematically investigated. The work was careful and methodical, as excavation in that environment has to be. The tombs are cut into soft limestone, and the stratigraphy is complicated by centuries of reuse and disturbance. You cannot rush limestone. In 1979, in a chamber designated Cave 24, specifically in a repository below the main burial chamber, a space where bones and grave goods had been swept after earlier burials to make room for new interments, Barkay's team found something extraordinary. The ceiling of the repository had collapsed in antiquity, probably during an earthquake. The collapse had been so complete, and the fallen material had sealed the space so effectively that the repository was invisible to anyone who came after. In the centuries when other tombs in the valley were being opened and their contents removed, this space had simply not been there for anyone to find. Inside, among the bones and the pottery and the jewelry and the arrowheads, were two tiny objects of silver. They were rolled up tight, scrolled into cylinders no bigger than the tip of your finger, too small and too fragile to unroll in the field, too significant to rush. They were brought to a laboratory, and the process of unrolling them was given to scholars with the equipment and the patience to do it safely. 3 years, not 3 months, 3 years of working on objects so fragile that the wrong breath could destroy them, under magnification, and with tools calibrated in fractions of a millimeter, in a controlled environment, trying to preserve whatever was inside without destroying the outside. What was inside was writing. In Paleo-Hebrew, an ancient script, the script of the First Temple period, the script of a Judah that had not yet been conquered by Babylon and scattered. the silver carried text, and the text, on both scrolls, was a version of the same passage. Numbers 6, verses 24 to 26. The priestly blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and give you peace. These are the oldest surviving words of the Hebrew Bible that have ever been found. They are dated to approximately the late 7th or early 6th century BC, around 600 BCE, which makes them contemporary with Jeremiah, contemporary with the final years of the Kingdom of Judah, centuries before the Dead Sea Scrolls, centuries before any other surviving biblical manuscript. And they were found in the slope of the valley that became hell. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem has those scrolls now. They sit in a climate-controlled case in the wing dedicated to the archaeology of the land of Israel. They are not large, they are not dramatic in appearance. They are two small squares of thinly rolled silver, mounted flat in a display case with careful preservation framing around them. You can stand in front of them on a Tuesday morning with other visitors walking past, and what you are looking at is the oldest piece of the Bible in the world. And it is a blessing. Remember those silver scrolls. We will come back to them tonight. Now hold something else for me. A small anomaly about the word hell itself. In the Bible, you have probably read or heard. You probably assume the word appears throughout the Old Testament, tracing a single coherent place from Genesis to Malachi, but one English word in your Bible is doing the work of 4 different places, 4 different words, 4 different meanings, all flattened into a single syllable by a set of translators working in the early 17th century. Hold that. We'll need it before the night is over. And there is one more thing to hold, something almost everyone who talks about Gehenna says with confidence. A fact that seems to explain everything, the detail that makes the fire make sense. We'll get to it. And what we find when we go looking for it will surprise you. But first, before we can understand what the Book of Enoch actually says about hell, we need to understand what the oldest layers of Scripture said, or rather, what they didn't say. And that is where this story gets quietly astonishing. The word in Hebrew is Sheol. It appears 65 times in the Hebrew Bible, across the Psalms and the wisdom literature and the histories and the prophecies, and the consistency of what it means across those 65 appearances is itself remarkable. The tradition did not debate this. Different authors, writing across centuries, in different genres and different contexts, all used the same word to describe the same undifferentiated destination. This was not a contested point. It was the baseline assumption. Think about what that means for a moment. The commandments in Leviticus, the historical narratives in Kings and Chronicles, the poetry of the Psalms, the philosophy of Ecclesiastes, the searing arguments of Job, the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, all of these texts, across the full range of the Hebrew Bible's literary output, share a single picture of what happens after death. One dark, everyone together, no sorting, no consequence, no fire. That consistency is not accidental. It is the bedrock of the oldest layer of the tradition, and it held across enormous variation in everything else. The biblical tradition contains extraordinary disagreements about kingship, about prophecy, about wisdom, about the nature of God's presence in the world. But about Sheol, there is no argument, because there is nothing to argue about. It is simply where the dead go, all of them. In the Hebrew Bible, across the Psalms, the wisdom literature, the histories, the prophecies, and it is the closest thing the oldest layers of Scripture have to an afterlife. But it is nothing like what you picture when you picture the afterlife. Sheol is not a place of punishment. It is not a place of reward. It is not a place of fire, or of darkness visible, or of sorting, or of judgment, or of any differentiation whatsoever between the wicked and the righteous. It is simply, and the simplicity is the point, the simplicity is the whole thing, where the dead go. All of them, everyone, together, without exception or distinction. In the Psalms, the dead in Sheol do not praise God. The living do, the dead do not. This is stated more than once in the text, and not as a lament or a complaint. It is stated as a simple description of reality, the way you might state that the dead do not eat or do not speak. Psalm 6, Psalm 30, Psalm 88. Across these texts, the same picture holds. Sheol is where the voice goes silent. There is no one there to praise. There is nothing happening that would require praise. Ecclesiastes, one of the more philosophical books of the Hebrew Bible, goes further. The dead know nothing, the teacher says. They have no wages, no memory, no share in anything that happens under the sun. They go to Sheol, which the text elsewhere describes as the common destination of the wise and the foolish alike. A single chamber that receives everyone without consideration of what they deserved. Job, who has every reason to want justice to exist in the afterlife. Job, who is righteous and who suffers, who loses his children and his property and his health without having done anything to deserve it, does not console himself with punishment awaiting his adversaries after death. The afterlife in Job is Sheol. It is described as a place of shadows and dust, where even the light is dark, where the dead are arranged like soldiers without knowing why, and where the silence is complete. The Hebrew word for shadow that appears in these passages is tsalmavet, literally shadow of death, a compound that ancient readers felt as a single concept, the way we feel the compound in the word twilight, without separating its two halves. It appears in Psalm 23 in a line that has been read at more funerals than perhaps any other words in human history. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That valley, in the psalm, is not Gehenna. It is not a specific geographic location at all. It is the darkest possible place in the experience of living, the worst moment, the deepest fear, from which the psalmist expects to be accompanied by God. Not rescued from death, but accompanied through it. And what lies on the other side of that accompaniment is Sheol, the shadow. There is no mechanism in the Hebrew Bible for escaping Sheol. There is no mechanism for deserving a better outcome. The great and the small, the prophets and the apostates, the kings and the servants, all go to Sheol. The same books that contain some of the most severe moral commandments in the ancient world do not contain a corresponding threat of punishment after death. The commandments are enforced, in the oldest layers of the text, by consequences in this life and in the life of the community: prosperity, exile, defeat, flourishing, not by what awaits you in another place. The covenant, in the oldest theology, operates in history. It is not deferred to the afterlife. This is genuinely startling, and I want to say clearly that it is not an argument against the religious tradition that grew from these texts, or an attempt to undermine anyone's faith. The rabbis who built Judaism in the centuries after the Second Temple's destruction were aware of exactly this. The development of afterlife belief was one of the major theological arguments between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the first century. The Sadducees, who read only the Torah and rejected traditions not found explicitly in the text, denied the resurrection. The Pharisees, whose traditions became the basis for rabbinic Judaism, affirmed it. The rabbis knew that Sheol was undifferentiated. The development of a more elaborate afterlife was a development, not a recovery. What I want to say is simply, this is what the oldest layers say, and the oldest layers we have are those silver scrolls from the Valley of Hinnom, carrying their blessing from a world that had not yet built a hell. Now let me return to those scrolls, because the detail of their discovery deserves to be held in the mind for a moment. The year was 1979. The archaeologist was Gabriel Barkay, working at Ge-Hinnom. Cave 24 had been identified as a burial chamber, and the team was carefully documenting it. Beneath the floor of the main chamber was a repository. a small space where accumulated bones and objects from previous burials had been swept aside, as was common practice in the rock-cut tomb tradition of this region, to make room for new interments. When a family member died, you opened the chamber, laid the new body inside, and swept the older bones into the repository below. The tomb was reused. The space was economical. The repository's ceiling had collapsed. That collapse, probably the result of an earthquake, possibly the earthquake of 749 BC that is mentioned in several ancient sources, possibly a later seismic event, had sealed the repository completely. For roughly 2,600 years, no one had been inside, while other tombs in the valley were being opened by tomb robbers in antiquity, by Ottoman-era treasure hunters, by early 20th century archaeologists working with more enthusiasm than precision. This small space, sealed under the fallen ceiling, was simply not accessible. It was not there to be found. When Barkay's team excavated the repository, they found nearly 1,000 objects, pottery from multiple periods, indicating long use of the chamber, jewelry in gold and silver, arrowheads and other metal implements that speak to the Iron Age world of soldiers and campaigns. The ordinary material of lives that ended and were laid in the rock and remembered, in the way that people have always remembered their dead. And among those objects, the 2 cylinders of rolled silver, each about an inch long, each containing a tightly scrolled sheet of silver so thin and so fragile that they could not be unrolled in the field without being destroyed, too significant to rush. The process of unrolling them took 3 years, not 3 months. 3 years of work in a laboratory with tools designed for other purposes being repurposed for this one, under magnification, in a controlled environment, with the knowledge that the wrong breath, the wrong movement, the wrong moment of humidity or heat could undo what the collapsed ceiling had preserved for 26 centuries. When the scrolls were finally open, and even then, the opening was gradual, done in stages, with each stage photographed and documented before proceeding, the text they revealed was written in Paleo-Hebrew, the alphabetic script of the First Temple period, the script that appears on inscriptions from the period of the Israelite monarchy, the script that was already old when these scrolls were made, the script that by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah was being replaced by the square Hebrew alphabet that we associate with Torah scrolls. This was the writing of the world that was ending when Jeremiah stood in the valley and smashed his clay flask and prophesied slaughter. And the text was a version of the priestly blessing, 2 copies, both carrying the same words that Numbers 6 tells us were given to Aaron and his sons to bless the people of Israel, words that have been spoken in synagogues and churches and at the bedsides of the dying for 3,000 years. 2 copies, written 600 years before the Common Era, in a tomb on the slope of the valley that the world came to call Hell. The Israel Museum has them now. A Tuesday morning, a climate-controlled case, the oldest Bible text in the world, a blessing. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that one word in your English Bible is doing the work of 4 different places. Let's put that precisely, because it matters to everything that follows tonight. The Hebrew Bible uses Sheol, the common destination of the dead, undifferentiated, no punishment, no fire, no sorting. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, in Alexandria, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, in the translation we call the Septuagint, the translators needed a Greek word for Sheol, and they chose Hades, the Greek underworld. In Greek tradition, Hades is itself a complicated place, with various zones and populations, more differentiated than Sheol, but it served well enough as a translation. When you read the Greek Old Testament, every occurrence of Sheol becomes an occurrence of Hades. Then there is Gehenna, the valley, the word, the place with the footpath and the wildflowers. This appears in the New Testament as the specific place of punishment and judgment, distinct from Hades, with a specific location, and a specific history. When Jesus uses this word, he is talking about a real valley outside the city he is teaching in. And then there is Tartarus, the Greek word for the deepest pit below the underworld, the place where the Titans were imprisoned in Greek mythology, the absolute bottom of the cosmos. It appears exactly once in the New Testament, in the second letter of Peter, in a passage about angels who sinned and the judgment awaiting them. 4 words, 4 places, 4 different concepts, different origins, different geographies, different populations, different meanings. 1 English word, hell. The flattening happened in translation. It happened primarily in the King James Bible of 1611, which was in conversation with the Latin Vulgate as much as with the original languages, and the Vulgate itself had used infernum and inferna, the underworld, somewhat interchangeably across these different original words. By the time the King James translators were working, the medieval picture of hell was firmly established in popular imagination, and they translated all 4 of these different terms with the single English word that their readers already understood. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a deception. It is translation. And translation is always a simplification, always a loss, always a passage from the complexity of one world into the available vocabulary of another. The translators were trying to help their readers. They succeeded, in the sense that the translation was used. But in the process, 4 different places with 4 different characters were collapsed into one. So when you read the word hell in your Bible, you do not know, without going back to the original languages, whether the text is describing Sheol, everyone goes there, no punishment, no sorting, Hades, the Greek underworld, complex and differentiated, with its own mythology and its own geography, Gehenna, a valley in Jerusalem, outside the city walls, with a specific history of defilement and a specific role in Second Temple theology, or Tartarus, the cosmic prison for defeated supernatural powers. Each of those places has a different shape, a different purpose, a different population, and a different atmosphere. They are not the same place. And let me add one more thing to what we have seen in Sheol, because it is directly relevant to what the Book of Enoch is doing. The Hebrew Bible's silence on an afterlife with moral sorting does not mean the tradition was comfortable with injustice. It means the tradition located its discomfort differently. The Psalms that express the deepest anguish about suffering, Psalms 22, 44, 88, are not comforted by the prospect of a better afterlife. They are not told to wait for the next world. They bring their complaint to God directly, in this world, and demand a response. The lament tradition, the tradition of crying out to God against the apparent unfairness of things, is not a tradition of patient waiting for post-mortem justice. It is a tradition of present-tense confrontation. The absence of hell in the Hebrew Bible is, in this sense, also the presence of something else, a theology in which the relationship between God and the people is live and active and contested in this world, not resolved in the next. The covenant is current. The complaint is current. The demand for justice is made now, not deferred. When that shifts, when the pressure becomes too great, when the empires are too powerful and the deaths too frequent, and the covenant too apparently suspended, the shift is not abandonment of the demand for justice. It is the expansion of where justice can operate, not instead of this world, but in addition to it, not instead of the complaint, but extending the horizon within which the complaint can be resolved. The Book of Enoch is that extension. It does not say, "Do not complain, wait for the next world." It says, "Here is where the complaint is being registered. Here are the chambers where the dead who died unjustly are crying out, and the angel has noted their cry. Here is the map of the infrastructure that will eventually resolve what cannot be resolved here. The machinery is real. The accounting will happen. The complaint is heard." That is why the Book of Enoch is so important. It does not simply add an afterlife, it adds an afterlife that is responsive to specific injustice. Each chamber corresponds to a category of moral experience. The machinery is not generic, it is tailored, which means the tradition it grew from, the tradition of naming specific injustice and demanding specific response, survived the development. The complaint did not evaporate into consolation. It became architecture. Hold that 4 words, 1 word problem. We will need it in a few hours when we come back up from the valley. And hold this, between those silver scrolls and the Gospels, roughly 6 centuries, an entire architecture appears. A full geography of the afterlife, with rooms and levels and prisons and valleys and mountains and abysses, and a judgment still ahead. Where did it come from? The oldest surviving blueprint for that geography is in a book that most people have never read, and most Bibles don't include. A book that was quoted by name in the New Testament, copied in multiple languages across centuries, preserved in Ethiopia when it was lost almost everywhere else, rediscovered in the 18th century by a Scottish traveller named James Bruce, who brought copies back from Gondar when almost no one in Europe remembered it existed. A book that describes, in careful physical detail, a guided tour of the places where the dead wait and the cosmic criminals are imprisoned. The Book of Enoch. To understand why the Book of Enoch builds what it builds, you need to feel the problem it was trying to solve. The Hebrew Bible's oldest theology, the theology of Sheol, of a common dark where everyone goes regardless of how they lived, works reasonably well in a particular kind of world. If you live in a culture where the community is the primary unit of meaning, where prosperity and disaster are experienced collectively, where the blessings of the covenant fall on the people, and the punishments of unfaithfulness are exile and defeat and drought that the whole community experiences together, then individual afterlife is not a pressing theological problem. The world can be just in the long run, even if individual lives end before the accounting is complete. The good die sometimes and the wicked flourish sometimes, but the arc of history bends toward the people, and the people will see justice in their collective story. That framework requires history to cooperate. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III and then Shalmaneser V destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 northern tribes were scattered, absorbed into the Assyrian deportation system, lost to history as a coherent community. The accounting for those people, the promise that the covenant would be vindicated in the life of the nation, simply could not be fulfilled. The nation was gone. In 586 BC, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the kingdom of Judah. The temple was burned, the city was razed, the leadership was deported to Babylon. Those who remained were the poorest, the least significant, not rescued but simply not worth deporting. For a theology that located divine promise in the life of the nation, this was not a setback, it was a catastrophe. The nation that carried the covenant had ceased to exist. In the centuries that followed, the Jewish people lived under a succession of foreign empires. Babylonian, then Persian, then Macedonian Greek. Alexander's conquests brought a new kind of cultural pressure, the pressure to assimilate into a Hellenistic world that was seductive as well as violent. Greek culture was sophisticated and appealing. The gymnasium, the theatre, the philosophy, the art. These were not obviously inferior to the traditions of a small ancient nation, and the pressure to become Greek, to adopt Greek practices, to participate in the Greek public world, was accompanied by the material rewards that came from integration. Under the Seleucid Empire, the successors of Alexander who ruled over Judea from Syria, the pressure became explicit policy. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, in the 2nd century BC, attempted to compel the Jewish population to abandon their distinctive practices and assimilate into the Hellenistic world. The temple was desecrated, scrolls of the Torah were burned, circumcision was forbidden, keeping the Sabbath was forbidden, and people who refused to comply were killed. This is the context that the books of Maccabees describe. The context of the Hanukkah story, which in its original form is not primarily about a miracle of oil, that tradition develops later, but about armed resistance to religious persecution. And it is a context in which people were dying, not because they had sinned, but because they had been faithful. The righteous were dying badly. The wicked were dying comfortably. And the old accounting, the one that ran through communities and through history, and through the long arc of the covenant, was visibly, undeniably not working. If you believe in a just God, and the world looks unjust, you have a limited number of moves available. You can say the injustice is temporary and will be corrected in history, but the history of the past 4 centuries has not been encouraging. You can say your understanding of justice is wrong and the ways of the divine are beyond human comprehension, but this is hard to say to someone whose family was killed for refusing to eat pork. Or you can extend the accounting beyond this life. You can say that the balance is not struck here, but somewhere else, somewhere after, somewhere that is not subject to the contingencies of which empire happens to be in power this century. The 2nd and 1st centuries BC are precisely the period when Jewish afterlife belief develops the architecture we recognize. This is not a spontaneous invention, it is a response to pressure. The idea that the dead wait in differentiated places, that the righteous go to a place of light, and the wicked to a place of darkness, that judgment is still ahead rather than already complete. This idea arrives in Jewish literature during precisely the centuries when Jewish people had the most reason to need it. The Book of Enoch is the primary document of this development. It is actually several documents. Scholars have identified 5 major sections, each with its own date, author, and character, assembled over roughly 2 centuries. But together, they constitute a universe of afterlife geography that nothing before them matches in detail or in scope. The text was written in Aramaic, probably in stages between the 3rd century and the 1st century BC. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, fragments of multiple sections in multiple copies, indicating that it was read seriously and valued highly by the communities that preserved those scrolls. It was not a marginal text. It was quoted by name in the Epistle of Jude, which is in the New Testament. The 14th verse of Jude cites Enoch as a prophet and quotes his words directly. Whatever you think of its theological status, its influence is not in question. James Bruce, the Scottish traveller who encountered full copies of the Ethiopic version of Enoch in the 18th century and brought them back to Europe, could not have known what he was carrying. The text had been preserved in Ethiopia because it was canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the very few Christian traditions that includes it in its Bible, and Ethiopian monks had been copying it for over 1,000 years when Bruce encountered it. It is one of the remarkable survivals of the ancient world, a text that shaped the New Testament, was quoted in it, and then was lost from the mainstream tradition for over a millennium, surviving in a single corner of African Christianity. Now, I want to offer 3 ways of reading what the Book of Enoch does, because all 3 are real, and it is not my place to tell you which one is correct. The first reading is developmental. Enoch is a document of transition. It shows us how the theology of the afterlife was being constructed during a specific historical period, under specific pressures, by specific communities, drawing on specific available materials. In this reading, the book is historically precious precisely because it is a blueprint. We can see the work in progress, can see which ideas are being borrowed from which traditions and which are being innovated, can see the exact moment when the architecture first appears in something like the form the New Testament will inherit. The second reading is comparative. Enoch's afterlife geography did not appear from nothing. The Second Temple period was a cosmopolitan world with Jewish communities in contact with Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Egyptian traditions across the full length of the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia and beyond. Greek Tartarus and the differentiated Hades were known to educated people throughout this world. The Zoroastrian tradition, the Persian religion that had direct influence on Jewish thought during and after the Babylonian exile, had a well-developed afterlife with a judgment bridge, a moral sorting, and differentiated outcomes for the righteous and the wicked. The Egyptian tradition, with its weighing of the heart against the feather of truth, described a moral accounting after death that was ancient when Alexander was born. Some scholars argue that Enoch is the record of how Jewish theological imagination processed and transformed these influences, adapting existing architectures to serve a new purpose within a different tradition. The third reading is traditional, for many believers within Judaism and Christianity, and for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which regards Enoch as canonical scripture. Enoch's visions are understood as genuine revelation, a real journey, a real guided tour, or at minimum a spiritually authentic account of realities that exceed ordinary human experience and that human language can only approximate. This reading does not require the developmental or comparative context to find the text meaningful. It asks to be taken on its own terms, as a first-person account of something that actually happened. Nothing tonight is a claim about which of these readings is correct. The history of an idea is interesting whether or not the idea is true, and the history of this idea is among the most interesting in the world. The world that produced this book was a world of scrolls and copying and careful transmission, and the Book of Enoch participated in all of that. The fragments found at Qumran, fragments of the Aramaic original, in multiple copies, representing multiple sections of the larger work, tell us that by at least the late 2nd century BC, the text was being read carefully and copied with the attention reserved for important documents. The community at Qumran was selective. They were not a lending library. They kept what they valued. And what they valued, in the Book of Enoch, was the geography, the descriptions of where things are kept, the architecture of the places that the human eye cannot see. Because this is what the tradition needed most urgently. Not arguments about what God is like, not stories about kings and kingdoms, but a map, a specific, physical, addressable map of where the dead go and where the cosmic criminals are held, and where, finally, the accounting will be completed. The need for a map is itself telling. Abstract assertions that God is just are not enough when the evidence in front of you suggests otherwise. What the community's reading Enoch needed was evidence, specific, detailed, locatable evidence, that the machinery of justice existed and was already operating. Not that it would be set up someday, not that it might exist in some form we cannot specify, but that it is already there. The hollow mountain is already receiving the dead and sorting them. The abyss is already holding the prisoners. The accursed valley is already waiting. The judgment will come, and when it comes, the infrastructure for it is in place. That urgency, the urgency of needing the map to be real, specific, and already operational, is part of what gives the Book of Enoch its distinctive character. It is not poetry about the afterlife. It is not philosophical argument about the afterlife. It is a travel account from someone who went there and came back with descriptions precise enough to be useful. Now let me plant two things for much later in the night, things to hold while we go through the rooms of the book. The first thing, when the Book of Enoch shows Enoch the accursed place, the specific location designated for those who are condemned, it is not underground. It is not at the edge of the world. It is somewhere recognizable, somewhere that has a name and a location, and a relationship to a specific city that Enoch and his readers knew very well. Hold that. We will need it around the time the night starts to feel deepest. And the second thing, in the section of Enoch that describes the abyss, the cosmic prison for those who broke the fundamental rules of the created order. The text says something very specific about what is imprisoned there. 7 mountains, 7 stars, bound because they broke a rule, a sentence that has not yet been completed. Hold that too. Remember 7 mountains and 7 stars that broke a rule. We come back to that before the night is over. The tour begins in the west, in the section of 1 Enoch that scholars call the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, which are among the oldest parts of the text, and which were almost certainly circulating independently before the larger collection was assembled. Enoch is taken by an angel on a journey to the edges and the depths of the world. The journey is not metaphorical. It has specific waypoints, specific directions, specific descriptions of what is seen at each stop. It reads like a travel account, which is exactly what it is meant to read like. A first-hand report from a human being who went somewhere no living person should be able to go, and came back to describe what he found. Around chapter 22, Enoch comes to a mountain. But mountain is the wrong word for what the text describes, or at least it is incomplete. In Hebrew and Aramaic, the same word that describes a mountain can also describe a high place, an elevated region, a prominence in the landscape. And what Enoch sees is something that contains hollow spaces, chambers inside the rock. And these chambers are where the dead wait. The Greek text of this section describes 4 separate divisions within the hollow mountain. The first is for the spirits of righteous people who have died. In this first division, there is a spring of bright water, a source of light and of something that functions like refreshment, a sense of rest and peace, a quality of the place that distinguishes it from the others. The second division is for those who died without seeing justice, who cry out about the injustice of what happened to them. They are held, and their complaints are preserved, held until the judgment when they will be answered. The third is for those who did wrong, but were punished in life, who therefore wait in a different state from those who did wrong, and escaped consequence during their years on earth. And the fourth is for those who sinned greatly and are not among the righteous. And this last division is the harshest, though even here the text is more interested in the condition of waiting than in any specific ongoing torment. The key word in the chapter is waiting. This is not a place of active punishment. It is a place of separation and holding. The dead are kept, sorted, differentiated, until the day of the final judgment, which has not yet happened. Enoch is explicitly told this by the angel who accompanies him through the chambers. The judgment is still ahead. What he is seeing is an intermediate state, a holding pattern, not a final outcome. If you have watched the earlier video in this series, the one about where the dead wait, about Sheol and the intermediate state, you will recognize this map. These 4 chambers are the architecture that tradition is beginning to build. They are what the space between death and judgment looks like, in the oldest detailed account we have. What is important to notice here is what the punishment actually is. The most startling outcome in this hollow mountain is not fire. It is sorting. It is being placed in the wrong chamber. The horror that the text seems most invested in, the horror that has the most emotional weight in the description, is the horror of being in the dark chamber while the bright one is audible, being close to the spring of water and not being able to reach it, the light from the first division, visible but inaccessible. The distance is the punishment. The nearness without access is the sentence. That is a different kind of dread from burning, and it is the older one. The 4 chambers in Enoch's mountain are not described with equal attention. The first, the one for the righteous, receives the most careful description, as if the writer dwelt there longest, imagined it most vividly, wanted it most fully realized. The spring of water is there, the light is there, the quality of peace is there, described not in emotional terms but in physical terms, the way a sensory reality is described rather than an abstract state. You feel the coolness of the spring. You understand that the light is not torment. This attention to the good chamber tells you something about who is writing and why. This is not a document written by people who want to dwell on suffering. This is a document written by people who need the good outcome to be vivid and real and habitable. The righteous dead need to be somewhere specific, somewhere you can picture, somewhere that validates the choice to remain faithful, even when faithfulness leads to death. The early readers of Enoch, the communities at Qumran, the apocalyptic communities in various parts of Judea and the diaspora, included people who had lost family members to persecution, to poverty, to the ordinary injustice of living under empire. The chambers in the mountain were not abstract theology to them. They were, in a sense, addresses, locations where the dead were kept while the accounting was completed. And the worst outcome in the mountain is not the fourth chamber. The worst outcome is failing to be in the first, having the light visible and being unable to reach it. That specific geometry, close enough to know, too far to touch, is the horror that the text seems most interested in conveying. Not the darkness of the fourth chamber in isolation, but the darkness of the fourth chamber in relation to the light of the first. The punishment of distance is always relative. It requires proximity. It requires knowing what you're distant from. Feel the hollow of the night around you, if you're still with me. That quiet that is not quite silence. Whatever room you're in has its own particular darkness. The specific dark of late night has a character that the dark of early night doesn't, and both of them are different from the dark of a room you haven't been in before. The chambers in Enoch's mountain have their own darkness too. The dead know them by feel, in whatever kind of time the dead experience, while the judgment they are waiting for has not yet arrived. Further into the tour, further out from the inhabited world, further toward the boundary of the created order. In chapters 18 through 21 of the Book of Enoch, Enoch is taken to see what the text calls the ends of the heaven and the earth, a phrase that marks the absolute perimeter of what exists in the created order, the place where the map has a final edge. And at that boundary, he sees things that the text tries very hard to describe. He sees 7 mountains. They are not ordinary mountains. They burn. The quality of the burning is described as something that cannot be approached, something not for human proximity even in a vision. These are not geographic features of the landscape in the ordinary sense. They are something more like markers of the boundary itself, the places where the structure of the created world meets whatever lies outside it, mountains of fire at the edge of the map. Beside or beneath these mountains, the spatial language becomes uncertain here, because the spatial logic is different from ordinary geography. There is an abyss, and the abyss is described with a precision that the translators have always found difficult to convey in English. The text says, "There is no earth beneath it, and no heaven above it." Read that slowly. No earth beneath, no heaven above. It is not merely a very deep place. It is not underground in any ordinary sense. It is a location that is outside the structure of creation, a void that exists where the structure simply does not extend. It is where things go when they are removed from the order of the universe entirely, not placed in a different part of the universe, not sent to the bottom of it, but placed outside it. The way a letter might be removed from an alphabet, except that removing a letter from an alphabet doesn't create a void, and this removal does. And what is held in this abyss? Stars. Not metaphorical stars. Not stars being used as a literary image for something else. Enoch is told by the angel accompanying him that these are the stars that did not appear when they were called, that broke the course they were assigned, that violated the order of their appointed movement across the sky. They are here in the abyss because they broke a rule. They are bound. They are being held in this place, outside the structure of the world, waiting for the day when their sentence will be completed. The text uses the phrase, "until 10,000 years." This is not a specific duration in the way we think of specific durations. It is a way of saying a very long time, a duration beyond ordinary reckoning. The judgment has not happened. The sentence has not been carried out. This is a holding place, a prison on remand, for powers that broke the fundamental rules of the order they were placed in. The logic is cosmic, and the punishment is also cosmic, displacement. The worst thing that can happen to a star, to a being whose nature is to move in its appointed course, to rise in its season and set in its season, to be part of the visible, ordered rhythm of the heavens that the ancient world understood as the most fundamental expression of divine order. The worst thing that can happen to such a being is to be removed from that course entirely, to be placed where there is no earth to rise over and no heaven to cross, to be held still, held in the void. When motion in an ordered course is your nature and your purpose, the removal of that course is a kind of total negation. The horror is structural, and it is nothing like fire. The prison of the stars is the most abstract of Enoch's three main locations of punishment. The chambers of the mountain are human-scaled: rooms, chambers, divisions, a spring. The accursed valley, which we haven't reached yet, is even more human-scaled. A valley, beside a city, visible from above. But the abyss, with its 7 burning mountains and its imprisoned stars, operates at the scale of creation itself. This is the cosmic criminal division, the place for powers that operated at the level of the sky, whose transgressions were transgressions against the order of the universe, and whose imprisonment must therefore be outside the universe. This scaling matters. Enoch's map has rooms for different categories of wrongness, and the scale of the room corresponds to the scale of the transgression. Human wrongness is housed in human-scaled spaces, chambers in a mountain, a valley beside a city. Cosmic wrongness is housed in a cosmic-scaled space, outside creation, in the void where there is no earth beneath and no heaven above. The punishment fits not in the sense of being painful in the right proportions, but in the sense of being the right size and the right shape for what it is containing. There is something almost architectural in this. A good map is scaled correctly. The Book of Enoch is a map that has thought carefully about scale. If you're still awake just now, if the abyss hasn't taken you yet, if the valley is still ahead and you're somewhere in the stars, I'm curious about something. When you first heard the word hell as a child, what did you picture? What was in the image that arrived without your asking for it? Leave it in the comments if you'd like. I have a feeling the answers would make a room full of different images, and I find myself wondering which one goes with which hour of the night, which country, which childhood, which voice that first said the word. The geography of Enoch does not exist in isolation. The same centuries that produced the Book of Enoch produced, across the ancient world, similar attempts to describe what lies beyond the visible, to map the space where the dead go and the cosmic criminals are held and the final judgment waits. These similar attempts were being made in cultures that were in contact with each other, that shared trade routes and armies and languages and books. And the similarities across these traditions are not coincidental. In Greek tradition, Tartarus sits at the absolute bottom of the cosmos. In the Theogony of Hesiod, which is among the oldest Greek texts that survive, Tartarus is described as far below the earth as the earth is below the sky, a symmetry that makes it the cosmic floor. It is specifically a prison for defeated cosmic powers, the Titans whom Zeus defeated in the war that established the current order of things, and who are now bound in this deepest place, waiting. They are not simply suffering, they are contained. The bound figures in Tartarus are waiting for something. Their final fate is not certain. Their imprisonment is not identical to final judgment. They are held. Above Tartarus, in Hades, the geography is already differentiated by the time of Homer. In the 11th book of the Odyssey, Odysseus descends to the underworld and encounters multiple populations in different conditions. There is a section, Elysium, the Elysian Fields, for the blessed dead. And there is a section for those undergoing specific punishments for specific crimes. The punishments in Hades are tailored. Tantalus, who committed a particular transgression against the gods involving a violation of the sacred meal, is held in water that recedes when he tries to drink, surrounded by fruit that lifts away when he tries to reach it. His particular crime produces his particular punishment. Sisyphus, who tricked death, rolls his rock perpetually upward. Ixion turns on his wheel. These are not people in a generic punishment space. They are individuals whose specific transgressions have produced specific consequences designed to fit what they did. The structural echo in Enoch, where different categories of the dead wait in different chambers, where cosmic criminals are imprisoned in a place outside the structure, where the punishment has a logic that relates to the nature of the transgression. This resemblance is not exact. The details differ. The mythology is entirely different. But the underlying architecture is the same. The idea that the afterlife is sorted by what you were and what you did, that proximity to the good is the reward and distance from it is the punishment, that cosmic powers can sin and be imprisoned and wait for judgment. These structural ideas appear in both traditions in the same centuries, in a world where both traditions were accessible to educated people across the Mediterranean. In Persia, in the Zoroastrian tradition, which had been in intimate contact with Jewish culture for 2 centuries by the time the earliest parts of Enoch were being written, because the Persian Empire had been the overlord that allowed the Jewish exiles to return from Babylon and rebuild Jerusalem. The afterlife contains a bridge called the Chinvat Bridge. Everyone who dies must cross it. For the righteous, the bridge is wide and easy, the crossing is pleasant, and a beautiful figure meets them at the other side. For the wicked, the bridge narrows to the edge of a blade. They fall. And where they fall, there is a place of punishment, not waiting, immediate, individual, at the moment of death. This idea, the immediate individual judgment, the sorting at the moment of death rather than at the end of history, is different from what Enoch describes. Enoch's dead wait. They are held. The judgment is still ahead. But both traditions are working on the same question. The appearance of injustice in this life, the need for something to address it, the architecture required to house that something. Egypt's contribution to this geography is the most visual and the most ancient. The weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at appears in the Book of the Dead and in countless tomb paintings. The deceased's heart placed on one side of a scale, the feather of truth on the other, Anubis managing the balance, the scribe Thoth recording the result. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the deceased lived a life aligned with the order of the world, they pass into the field of reeds, into a version of the world that is what the world should be. If the heart is heavier, if the weight of what they did and how they lived has accumulated into something that tips the scale, the heart is eaten by Ammit, a creature assembled from the 3 most dangerous animals known to ancient Egyptians: the front of a lion, the back of a hippopotamus, the head of a crocodile. And if Ammit eats your heart, you cease to exist. Not punishment, erasure. The Egyptian tradition is at least as old as the writing tradition itself. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious documents in the world, contain elements of afterlife geography and judgment. By the time the Enochic literature was being written, Egypt's afterlife tradition was 2,000 years old. It had been elaborated and refined across those 2,000 years. It was known. Egyptian ideas about the soul, about the parts of a person that survive death, about the weighing and the accounting, were available across the ancient world in the centuries when Enoch was being assembled. The Chinvat Bridge deserves a little more time because the Zoroastrian influence on Jewish thought during and after the exile is one of the more interesting questions in the history of religion. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great allowed the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to their land in 538 BC. This is the event the Book of Ezra begins with, and the return it describes. For roughly 2 centuries after that, Judea was a Persian province, which meant that educated Jews were in direct contact with the Persian administrative apparatus and with the religious ideas that animated it. Zoroastrianism was the religion of the Persian court. Its ideas about cosmic dualism, the struggle between the forces of truth and the forces of the lie, about a judgment after death, about a final cosmic renovation at the end of history, were available to Jewish thinkers in a way that would not have been true in the Assyrian period. Scholars debate the extent of the influence. Some see Zoroastrian ideas as deeply formative for the development of Jewish apocalypticism. Others argue for parallel development, with both traditions responding to similar questions in similar ways without direct borrowing. The debate has not been settled, and may not be settleable, given how much of the evidence is missing. What is not debated is the fact of contact. The Persian period left material traces. Persian administrative vocabulary entered biblical Hebrew during this period, and the Book of Ezra and Nehemiah preserve documents from the Persian court that appear to be authentic. Ideas were moving across those administrative channels as surely as the documents were. The Chinvat Bridge, the cosmic judgment, the sorted afterlife, these were in the intellectual environment of the communities that produced the Book of Enoch. And then there is the question of the Egyptian material, which is older and wider and more available than the Zoroastrian. Egypt was not a distant abstraction for the Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. Egypt had been an important destination for Jewish refugees during the Babylonian conquest. Jeremiah himself, in the final chapters of the book that bears his name, is taken to Egypt against his will, and he addresses communities of Jews already settled there. Alexandria, under the Ptolemies after Alexander, became one of the largest and most important centers of Jewish life in the ancient world. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced in Alexandria. It was produced for Jews who were reading more Greek than Hebrew. They were surrounded by Egyptian culture, including Egyptian mortuary culture, including the Book of the Dead. The weighing of the heart is one of the most vivid images of moral accounting the ancient world produced. It is visual, immediate, and universal in its application. Everyone's heart is weighed. There are no exemptions. And the consequence of failure is not punishment as torment, but cessation. Amit eats the heart, and the person simply ceases to exist. No ongoing suffering, just the ending of the person. That termination model, the wicked simply stop existing rather than experiencing ongoing pain, is a tradition within Jewish and Christian thought too. The tradition of annihilationism, which argues that the final fate of the condemned is not eternal suffering, but cessation of existence, has been present in the tradition from the beginning, and some scholars argue it is actually more consistent with the imagery in the sources than the eternal torment model. The lake of fire in Revelation consumes. Fire, in the natural world, reduces to nothing. Ongoing burning that never concludes requires a miracle of preservation that the imagery does not obviously support. Whether or not that reading is correct, the point is that the Egyptian tradition, where the wicked cease rather than suffer, was available, was known, and contributed to the range of positions that thinkers in the Second Temple period had to work with as they constructed the map. A word about what this means and what it does not mean. Some listeners will hear these comparisons as an argument, as if pointing out that Zoroastrianism had a judgment bridge before Judaism developed its sorting mechanism, is intended to suggest that the Jewish tradition borrowed it, and therefore that it is not true. That is not the argument being made. Traditions influence each other. Human beings in contact share ideas. The fact that multiple cultures across the ancient world arrived at similar solutions to the same problem, the problem of injustice, the problem of how to account for what happens to the righteous dead, is not evidence that any of them is wrong. It is evidence of how deeply human the problem is. Every culture that thought carefully about justice was eventually pushed toward the same question, and the answers they built share the same architecture because they are answers to the same question. The Book of Enoch is part of that conversation. It is not the whole of it. It is the version that reached the New Testament, and it was not working in isolation. Before we reach the strangest passage in the whole book, before we get to the valley with an address, there is one more thing to understand about how fire enters this tradition. Because fire does enter it, just not all at once, and not the way we usually picture it arriving. In the Hebrew prophetic tradition, fire is already an image of divine judgment before the Book of Enoch exists. Isaiah, in chapters 30 and 66, describes a fire that does not go out, using it as an image of the fate of those who rebel against the divine order, not as a description of a specific place, so much as an image of a consuming and unstoppable judgment. Jeremiah, writing from the same era as those silver scrolls in the valley, uses fire as an image of the divine anger that burns against injustice. Daniel, in the visionary chapters at the end of the book, chapters written in the 2nd century BC, in the same period as the early parts of Enoch, probably by someone in the same broad intellectual community, describes a river of fire flowing before the divine throne, from which the books of judgment are opened and the dead are sentenced. Fire in all of these passages is imagery. It is the language of ending, of consuming, of the absolute undoing of a thing. It is not, in any of these texts, the language of ongoing torment in any technical sense, of someone being burned without being consumed, of a fire that operates as a medium of infinite maintenance rather than final destruction. The image is closer to what we would describe as, this is over, completely, finally, utterly. Fire as the consuming of what should no longer exist. The Book of Enoch uses fire in this way too. The 7 burning mountains at the edge of the world are fire as boundary, fire as marker of the absolute limit of the created order. The furnace language that appears in the later sections of Enoch, particularly in the section known as the Similitudes, which may be slightly later than the Book of the Watchers, is fire as final judgment, fire as the consuming of wrongness when the accounting is finally completed. It is conclusion, not maintenance. The shift to fire as something ongoing, fire as something that burns forever without consuming, fire as the medium of an eternal experience rather than a final event, is a development that happens gradually in texts that postdate the earliest layers of Enoch, and that reaches its most elaborate and influential form many centuries later, in the work of a 14th century poet. There is a distinction worth drawing here, because it matters for understanding how the tradition develops. The prophetic fire, the fire that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel use, is fire as metaphor, fire as image, fire as the way that divine judgment looks from the outside, to a human observer trying to describe something that exceeds ordinary language. These writers are not describing a physical location where physical fire burns. They are reaching for the most powerful image available to them, for something that is final, consuming, and real. The apocalyptic fire, the fire that begins to appear in the later sections of Enoch, and in the texts that follow in the same tradition, is something different. It starts to become a physical feature of the geography, a substance that exists in specific places, in the 7 burning mountains at the boundary of the world, in the rivers that the later texts describe flowing near the places of punishment. It transitions from image to element. And the eschatological fire, the lake of fire in Revelation, is different again. This is a final destination, a permanent feature of the ultimate state of things, a medium in which the condemned exist after the last judgment is complete. It is the end of the waiting, the conclusion of the interim. These 3 uses of fire, are often conflated in popular discourse about hell, as if they all mean the same thing and all come from the same tradition at the same time. But they don't. They are developments. Each one builds on the previous, and each one shifts the character of what is being described. The prophetic image becomes the apocalyptic geography, becomes the eschatological condition. The trajectory spans roughly 8 centuries, from Isaiah in the 8th century BC to the full development of the theology in the early Christian centuries. And at each stage, people were making choices about what the tradition required and what new imagery would serve. The Book of Enoch sits at the transition between prophetic image and apocalyptic geography. This is part of what makes it so important historically. It is not quite the prophet saying fire is how divine judgment looks, and it is not yet the systematic theology of an eternal state. It is a map, a physical map, with addresses, and some of the addresses have fire on them as a feature of the landscape, not as the whole content of the place. We will get to that, but first, there is the strangest passage in the whole book. Enoch is shown one more place, and it is not at the ends of the earth, it is not underground, it is not outside the structure of creation, it is somewhere he recognizes. In chapters 26 and 27 of the first book of Enoch, the geography changes. For most of the journey up to this point, Enoch has been at the edges, at the hollow mountain where the dead wait in their 4 chambers, at the abyss beyond the 7 burning peaks where the stars are imprisoned, in the space where the structure of the created world ends. The scales of the journey have been cosmic, the ends of heaven and earth, the boundary of creation, the space outside the universe. These are not places on any map that a living person could consult. Now the scale contracts. Enoch is brought, the text says, to the middle of the earth, to the center, and what he finds there is not what you might expect from someone who has just been shown the cosmic perimeter. He finds a mountain of blessed stone. The translation of this section, from the Ethiopic text, describes it as holy, set apart, as having streams of water flowing from it. It has the quality of a place that is what it should be, a place of rightness, of order, of something like blessing. And beside this mountain, beside it, not beneath it, not underground, but adjacent to it in the landscape, just as one geographical feature is adjacent to another, is something described as deep and dry and accursed. The angel Uriel, who accompanies Enoch through this section of the journey, answers when Enoch asks about the accursed valley. What is it for? The answer, in the Ethiopic text, this place is for those who are accused forever, the accursed ones who utter with their mouths inappropriate things against the Lord. Here shall they be gathered together, and here shall be their judgment in the last days. Righteous ones shall see it from above. Read that slowly. One more time. The righteous shall see it from above. The accursed valley in the Book of Enoch is not underground. It is not at the edge of the world. It is not in some cosmic space outside the structure of creation. It is adjacent to the holy mountain, beside it in the landscape, visible from the heights above it. And those who are in the right place will look down into it. This is the passage that scholars of Second Temple Judaism have found most remarkable in the whole book. Because if you are looking for a dry valley, adjacent to a holy mountain, at a place that the tradition identifies as the center of the world, visible from above to those who are on the mountain, what does that describe? Jerusalem is understood, consistently and explicitly, in Second Temple Jewish tradition, to be the center of the world. The Temple Mount is the holy mountain. It is referred to as the holy mountain in the Psalms, in Isaiah, in Ezekiel. And the valley beside it, to the south and to the southwest, the valley that runs along the base of the hill the city stands on, is the valley of the son of Hinnom, Ge-Hinnom, Gehenna. And from the Temple Mount's southern edge, you can see the valley below. It is not far, it is not hidden, it is there, in the landscape, with the footpath along the bottom and the rock-cut tombs in the slopes, and the olive trees, and, in spring, the wildflowers. I want to be precise about what scholars say here. The identification of Enoch's accursed valley with the Hinnom Valley is a scholarly proposal, not an established fact. Enoch does not name the valley. The text does not say, "This is Ge-Hinnom." The identification is proposed, strongly, by scholars who have worked carefully on this passage, because the description fits. The location fits. The topography fits. The role fits, because in the tradition that the Book of Enoch is part of, and that the Gospels inherit, Gehenna is precisely the place of final punishment, visible from the holy city, with a specific history of defilement that makes it the appropriate location for the accursed. But the text itself does not say the name. What it says is, beside the holy mountain, deep and dry and accursed, visible from above to the righteous. And hell, in this text, is not underground. Feel what that means for a moment. The entire tradition of hell as depth, hell as the place beneath, hell as underground, which is enormously powerful in the Western imagination, which gives us the word infernal from infernus, below, that tradition is not what the oldest map actually shows. The oldest map shows a valley, at ground level, beside the city, visible from above. The nearness is part of the picture. The proximity is not incidental, it is structural. Hell, in the Book of Enoch, is not separated from the holy mountain by infinite distance. It is separated from it by a ravine. You can see across it. You can hear, presumably, sounds from one side reaching the other. The accursed and the righteous are not in different dimensions. They are in different parts of the same landscape. Think about what that picture actually says about punishment. The horror is not primarily a physical sensation. Not fire, not cold, not physical pain. The horror is proximity without access. You are in the valley, and you can see the mountain. You know where the mountain is. You know what the mountain is, and you are in the valley. That is a particular kind of suffering. It has a name in psychology, though the Book of Enoch doesn't use it. It is the suffering of being in the wrong place, while knowing exactly where the right place is, of having your wrongness visible, from above, to the people who are in the right place, of being the view that the righteous look down at. Remember, in Enoch's cosmic prison, the punishment was displacement, being outside the structure, in the abyss where there is no earth beneath and no heaven above. But the punishment near the human world, in the valley beside the holy mountain, is not displacement. It is the opposite. It is being perfectly located in the wrong position, still on the map, still visible, just in the valley instead of on the mountain. And like the stars in the abyss, and like the dead in the hollow mountain, the people in the accursed valley are waiting. The text says, "In the last days." The judgment has not yet happened. The sentence has not yet been completed. The valley is a waiting room with an address, not a place where anything final has occurred. Everything in the Book of Enoch is interim. Everything is held until the accounting that is still ahead. There is one more thing worth sitting with in this passage before we move on. The viewing gallery. The text says, "The righteous shall see the accursed valley from above." This is not incidental. It is not a detail that slipped in accidentally. The visibility of the valley from the mountain is part of the purpose. Part of what makes the valley what it is being visible, being seen. In the ancient world, burial practices were deeply tied to the idea of witness, of having your death acknowledged, your body treated with dignity, your grave marked and visited. The absence of proper burial was itself a punishment, not because of anything it did to the body, but because of what it did to the person's status among the living. Jeremiah's Valley of Slaughter is terrible not only because of the death it describes, but because of the exposure, bodies lying in the open, unburied, visible, attended by no mourners, acknowledged by no one. Being left out in the open without the dignity of concealment, was one of the worst things the prophets could imagine happening to a person. The accursed valley reverses this. It does not simply conceal the condemned, it makes them visible. From the mountain to the righteous, the wrongness is on display. And there is something almost impossibly intimate about this, in the context of the landscape. The Valley of Hinnom is not a great distance from the Temple Mount. It is not across a sea or a desert or a mountain range. You could stand on the Temple Mount's southern edge and throw a stone into the valley below, if you had a strong arm. The people in the valley and the people on the mountain are neighbors. They are in the same city. They share the same sun and the same seasonal rains and the same view of the same sky. The closeness is the dread. If they were separated by an ocean, the separation would be complete and the question of seeing would not arise. But they are separated by a ravine, and the text insists that the seeing will happen. The righteous will look down, the accursed will be visible. Whether this is meant as a kind of justice, the victims seeing the acknowledgement of their wronging, or as a kind of additional suffering for the condemned, being seen in their wrongness by those they wronged, or as both simultaneously, the text does not resolve. It simply states the fact, visible from above. The valley in Jerusalem, in the 2nd century BC, when this was written, was visible from the city walls. You could stand on the wall and look south and see it. On a clear day, you could probably make out figures moving in the valley below. The writer of this passage knew that geography, and chose it. Now let me come back to the silver scrolls. We planted them at the beginning of the night, and this is where they pay off. In 1979, on the slope of the valley that the Book of Enoch seems to identify as the accursed valley, the slope called Ge-Hinnom, the shoulder of Hinnom, a collapsed ceiling preserved a repository from 2,600 years of looting. Inside the repository, 2 tiny cylinders of silver, and on the silver, the oldest words of the Hebrew Bible ever found. A blessing. From a world that had not yet named the valley hell, from a world that knew Sheol and not Gehenna, that knew a common dark and not a sorted architecture, that knew the priestly blessing and buried it in the rock, so that even if the people disappeared and the kingdom fell and the temple burned, the blessing would still be there. And it was. Feel the night air through whatever opening is near you. If the room has gone quiet, if the city outside has gone down to its late-night murmur, if you can hear your own breathing, that is the actual world, holding you in its ordinary hours. The valley in Jerusalem is in its own night right now, a few time zones away, with the city lit on the hill above it. Dogs walk there in the evenings. People jog the footpath. The tombs are in the slope, as they have been for 3,000 years. And somewhere in the slope, in a sealed deposit, for 2,600 years, a blessing waited. Until the archaeologist's team came, in 1979, and the ceiling that had fallen became the very thing that preserved what was inside. The map can wait until morning. The judgment is still ahead. For now, the blessing is in the ground. We come back up now, out of the valley, back up the slope, past the tombs in the limestone, up to the level of the city. The sounds of the ordinary world, traffic on the road above, the particular quiet of the hour, the city doing its night work. We've been in the map. Now we come back to the territory. Let me answer the question we opened with. What does the Book of Enoch actually say about hell? We have the answer now. It says, a hollow mountain with 4 chambers where the dead wait in different conditions for the final judgment. A cosmic abyss outside the structure of creation where stars and fallen powers are imprisoned on remand. A dry valley adjacent to the holy mountain at the center of the world, visible from above, where the accursed wait for their judgment in the last days. Displacement, sorting, proximity without access, exposure, waiting. That is the map. That is the oldest surviving detailed blueprint for what comes after death. and now let me pay off the whisper loops I planted early in the night. The 4 words, 1 word problem. Your English Bible translates Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus, all with a single word, hell. These are 4 different places, from 4 different traditions, with 4 different populations and 4 different purposes. Sheol is the undifferentiated common dark of the Hebrew Bible. Hades is its Greek translation, which carries a richer mythology. Gehenna is the valley outside Jerusalem, applied to the place of final judgment in the New Testament. Tartarus is the Greek cosmic prison for defeated supernatural powers, appearing once in the 2nd letter of Peter. When you read the word hell in your Bible, you are reading 1 word doing the work of 4. The flattening happened in translation, in the Vulgate and then in the King James, as the medieval picture of a single hell became the framework through which all 4 were understood. That is what happened to the words. Now for the rubbish dump. I planted this early, the claim that everyone makes, that Gehenna was Jerusalem's constantly burning rubbish dump, that this is why fire is associated with it, that Jesus' audience could smell the burning refuse and understood immediately what he meant. Here is what the scholarly investigation finds. No ancient source says this. Not one, not a Roman historian describing Jerusalem's infrastructure, not a Jewish writer in the Second Temple period documenting the city's waste management, not an early Christian writer explaining the metaphor for a Gentile audience, not an archaeologist who has found evidence of sustained burning in the valley floor that would indicate a rubbish dump. The ancient sources about Gehenna describe its dark history, the Topheth, the Josiah's defilement, Jeremiah's prophecy, the accumulated religious significance. They do not describe a rubbish dump. The explanation traces, as far as scholars can determine, to the medieval Jewish commentator David Kimhi, who lived and wrote in Provence around 1200 AD, more than 1,000 years after the Gospels. More than 1,000 years after the tradition was established. Kimhi, commenting on a passage in Jeremiah, offered the rubbish dump as an explanation of the fire imagery, and from Kimhi, the explanation entered the commentary tradition, and from the commentary tradition, it entered the popular tradition, and from the popular tradition it became the confident assertion that appears in footnotes and sermons and popular books on biblical history. Gehenna was Jerusalem's rubbish dump. It was not. There is no ancient source for it. There is a medieval commentator who proposed it, 1,000 years after the fact, trying to explain something that was already old and already settled. A modern legend wearing ancient clothes. So, no rubbish dump, and almost no fire in the original sources. What happened to the fire? The apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period develops it gradually. The similitude section of Enoch, which may be the latest major addition to the text, possibly from the 1st century BC or early 1st century CE, uses fire language more extensively than the earlier Book of the Watchers. The Sibylline oracles, Jewish and then Christian texts circulating across the 1st century and beyond, develop vivid fire imagery. The Revelation of John, the final book of the Christian Bible, describes a lake of fire as the ultimate destination of the condemned. But even there, this is eschatological, at the end of history, as a final judgment, not as an already ongoing state for the currently dead. The idea of hell as a permanent state, already active, already receiving the dead who have not yet faced a final judgment. This develops in early Christian theological debate over the first several centuries of the Common Era as theologians worked out the relationship between death, judgment, and the ultimate fate of the wicked. Different schools had different views. The tradition was not monolithic. It was being assembled, argued over, refined, in precisely the way that all theological traditions are assembled. And then Dante. In 1320 AD, a Florentine poet named Dante Alighieri, born around 1265, exiled from Florence in 1302, writing through the years of his exile, completed the Commedia. The first part of it is the Inferno, a journey through hell, led by the Roman poet Virgil, guided by the love of Beatrice. Hell in the Inferno is organized into 9 concentric circles, descending deeper as the sins become more serious. There are the lustful, blown by winds in the second circle. There are the gluttonous, in rain and slush, in the third. There are the wrathful and the sullen in the 5th circle, in the river Styx, the wrathful fighting each other on the surface, the sullen gurgling their hymns beneath the mud. There are the heretics in burning tombs, the violent in rivers of boiling blood, the fraudulent in ditches of burning pitch, and at the absolute bottom, in the 9th circle, in ice, Satan, frozen to his waist, weeping from 6 eyes, his 3 mouths each chewing on history's greatest traitors. It is one of the greatest works of imaginative literature ever produced. It is also explicitly fiction. Dante knew it was fiction. He was a poet, not a prophet. He was working within the theological tradition of his era and using it as the material for an allegory about justice, about love, about the consequences of choices, about the political situation of early 14th century Italy. He put his political enemies in hell. He put the Pope in hell. He was making arguments through the medium of vivid fantasy, and the people of his time understood that this is what he was doing. But the images are so powerful that they outlasted the context, the 9 circles, the specific punishments tailored to specific sins. The river Styx, the burning city of Dis, the ice at the bottom, the 3-mouthed Satan. These are not ancient images. They are 14th century images. They are the invention of a brilliant medieval Italian poet working with the theological tradition he had received and his own extraordinary imagination. And they have dominated Western popular imagination of hell ever since. Most of what you picture when you picture hell, if you were raised in or near Western culture, is Dante. Not the Book of Enoch, not the Gospels, Dante. This is not an argument that hell doesn't exist, or that the tradition is invalid. It is an observation about the history of images. The images that dominate are not always the oldest ones, and the oldest ones are often quieter and stranger and more disturbing in different ways than the dramatic images that replaced them. The Book of Enoch says, distance, waiting, displacement, and exposure. The valley beside the city, visible from the mountain. The abyss, outside creation. The chambers in the rock. A judgment still ahead. Dante says, fire and ice and specific punishments already being experienced by souls already judged, in a geography that maps the moral universe through the architecture of descent. One of these is the oldest surviving map. One of them is what most people carry. The trajectory from Enoch to Dante is not a straight line, and the stops along the way are interesting in themselves. The New Testament writers, working in the 1st century CE, in the decades after the death of Jesus, and in the context of the early communities forming around his teaching, inherited Enoch's vocabulary without always inheriting its precision. When the Gospel writers report Jesus using the word Gehenna, they are using the specific valley's name that Enoch's tradition had already charged with meaning. The valley outside Jerusalem, the accursed dry valley beside the holy mountain, the place visible from above. But as the early communities spread beyond Jerusalem, into Asia Minor, into Greece and Rome, into the diaspora communities across the Mediterranean, the specific geography became less available as a reference point. For someone in Corinth or Ephesus or Rome, the Valley of Hinnom was not a place they had ever seen. They could not picture it from personal knowledge. And the images that were available to them, images from Greek and Roman mythology, from the philosophical traditions about the underworld, from the apocalyptic literature that was circulating in multiple languages, filled the space. The Book of Revelation, written toward the end of the 1st century CE, describes a lake of fire that receives the beast and the false prophet and death and Hades itself, and all whose names are not found in the Book of Life. The lake of fire is an image that does not appear in the earlier Enoch material. It is an escalation. Fire not as a boundary marker or a consuming judgment, but as a substance, a permanent medium. And the finality of the lake of fire in Revelation is greater than the finality in Enoch. In Revelation, death and Hades are thrown into the lake. The waiting rooms are emptied into the conclusion. The development continued in the early centuries. The theological writings of Origen in the 3rd century, of Augustine in the 5th, of Gregory the Great in the 6th, each of these contributed to the evolving picture of what awaited the dead, and they were working with a range of sources: the biblical texts, the philosophical traditions, the apocalyptic literature, and their own pastoral experience of communities trying to understand what death meant and what justice required. Augustine is particularly important here. His City of God, written in the early 5th century in response to the sack of Rome by Visigoths in 410, contains extended discussions of the fate of the wicked after death, and Augustine's position that the punishment of the damned is real, eternal, and not merely metaphorical, became enormously influential in shaping Western Christian theology's understanding of hell. Augustine was not inventing, he was interpreting, in the context of his own moment, the range of texts available to him, but his interpretation carried enormous weight because of his authority, and that weight passed through the medieval period into the world that Dante inherited. Dante, then, was working with all of this, with the biblical texts, in Latin, with Augustine and Gregory, and the medieval theological tradition, with Virgil, whose 6th book of the Aeneid described a journey through the underworld in terms that Dante found indispensable. Virgil became Dante's guide through hell for a reason. The Aeneid's underworld was already the most vivid extended description of afterlife geography in the Western literary tradition before Dante built on it. And Dante was also working with the political situation of early 14th century Italy, which was violent and factional and full of people who, in Dante's view, deserved very specific punishments in very specific circles. What Dante did was take all of this material and make it inhabitable. He gave it characters, named individuals, real people, historical and contemporary, who spoke and suffered and explained their situations. He gave it sensory specificity of a quality that no previous document had achieved: the exact smell of the burning pitch, the exact sound of the frozen traitors in the ice, the exact weight of the leaden cloaks that the hypocrites wore. He made it a place you could visit, not just a concept you could describe, and he was a great enough poet that the visit has lasted. But it is the 14th century, not the 2nd century BC, not the Book of Enoch, not the valley outside Jerusalem. Whether any of it is true is not something these documents can settle. What they can tell you, what we have traced tonight, is who drew which line and when. The resolution of the night's question is not a debunking, it is a clarification. What the Book of Enoch actually says about hell is precise, and it is interesting, and it is stranger and quieter than the popular image. Chambers and waiting, displacement and exposure, a valley with an address, a judgment still ahead. What the popular image contains, fire and ice, and 9 circles and Satan, frozen to his waist, and the specific torments of specific sinners in specific arrangements, is 14th century literature. Good literature, important literature. Literature that has shaped how Western culture understands death and judgment and justice and the consequence of choices. But literature from the 14th century, not from the 2nd century BC. Between those two dates, across roughly 16 centuries, the tradition was assembled, elaborated, argued over, simplified, translated, retranslated, popularized, institutionalized, reformed, complicated, and handed on. Each generation worked with what the previous generation had given it and added what their own moment required. The result is not one thing but many things, braided together so thoroughly that it is very difficult to see the individual strands. Tonight we tried to see them. The valley gave its name, Enoch gave the geography. The Gospels deployed the valley's name in the context of the Enochic geography. The letters of Paul and Peter contributed the cosmic prison and the final judgment. Revelation contributed the lake of fire. The theologians of the early church contributed the ongoing state. And Dante contributed the vivid, inhabitable, specific, unforgettable floor plan. The strands braided together into the image that most people in the Western world carry. And the strands, seen separately, are all interesting in themselves, not because they disprove anything, but because they reveal the work. They reveal that this was built, that real people, working in real historical circumstances, with real needs and real tools, drew these specific rooms in this specific order over these specific centuries. And knowing that is not the same as knowing the rooms don't exist. It is simply knowing the history of the drawing. And what remains true either way, real people, under real pressure, needed the world to come out fair. The people who built the earliest architecture of the afterlife were watching empires crush faithful communities without consequence, watching the righteous die in pain and the wicked die in comfort. Every terrible room in that map was built by someone who had watched something unfair happen and refused to accept it as the final word. Every chamber of waiting, every cosmic prison, every accursed valley visible from the holy mountain, these were built by people who needed there to be more than what they could see, who needed the accounting to continue after the grave, who needed the ledger, eventually, to balance. That need was real. It is still real, and the need's realness does not depend on whether the architecture it produced is literally accurate. Most of us carry an inherited picture of something we have never examined. A place, a word, a shape in the imagination that was given to us before we were old enough to ask where it came from. A fear that arrived already formed, handed down through language and image, and the serious faces of adults telling us serious things, pressed into our hands like a map of a territory we were told existed and warned not to enter, without anyone explaining who had drawn the map or when or why. Tonight, you walked through the process of the drawing. You saw the valley, the real valley, a geological fold in the rock, 20 minutes to walk from end to end. You saw what happened there in the Iron Age, and how a reforming king deliberately marked it as unclean, and how a prophet renamed it the Valley of Slaughter, and how those two acts of naming layered onto a place that already had its own weight from its own history. You saw the oldest words of Scripture found in 1979 in a sealed chamber in its slope, a blessing, carried in silver, buried there before any of the hell architecture was built, waiting for 2,600 years with extraordinary patience under a fallen ceiling. You saw Sheol, the common dark of the oldest Hebrew scripture, where everyone goes together, without sorting, without punishment, without fire. A world where justice was expected in history, not in the afterlife, because the afterlife had no rooms for justice to operate in. And you saw the pressure that changed that. Empires destroying faithful communities, the righteous dying in pain, while the wicked died in comfort. The demand, the basic human demand, that the world come out fair in the end, somewhere, if not here then somewhere, if not now then when. You saw the Book of Enoch respond to that demand, carefully, specifically, with an architecture of chambers and abysses and valleys, each one housing a different category of the dead or the cosmic fallen, all of them waiting for a judgment that is still ahead. You saw what the oldest map actually shows, not fire, primarily, but distance. Not torment, primarily, but displacement. The horror of the wrong position, the wrong chamber, the wrong valley, the wrong side of the ravine. And you saw what was added later, the rubbish dump that no ancient source mentions, the fire that developed gradually from an image into an environment. The 9 circles that a Florentine poet drew in the 14th century, with such vividness that they have been mistaken for ancient truth ever since. The map was assembled. It was assembled by people trying their best, under pressure, with the tools and the traditions and the questions available to them. They were not deceiving anyone. They were doing what human beings do when the world seems to be failing at justice. They projected the corrective machinery into a space beyond the world's visible reach, and they built the rooms to house it. And now you have walked through those rooms, and you know when each one was built, and by whom, and in response to what. Some of the things we were most afraid of turn out, when you examine them carefully, to have been assembled by people who were themselves afraid, in circumstances very different from ours, using the vocabulary and the imagery available to them to solve a problem that was real and urgent, and that they could not solve any other way. That doesn't make the fear invalid. The problem was real. The need was real. The demand for justice is as real now as it was in the 2nd century BC, when someone in the shadow of empire sat down and wrote about chambers in a hollow mountain. But it does mean the picture is not quite as old, or quite as fixed, or quite as unexamined as it appeared before tonight. And it means that the oldest thing, the oldest piece of Bible text we possess, is not a map of punishment. It is not a warning. It is a blessing buried in the valley, in a small cylinder of silver, written in a script that was already old when it was made. You are not the map. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment, in the particular quiet of wherever you are right now. The map was built by frightened people. Not weak people. Frightened people can be enormously strong, and the people who built this map were producing works of literature and theology and philosophy while their communities were being killed for their faith. But frightened because fear is a reasonable response to injustice, and the injustice they faced was real. The map was an act of defiance against the appearance that the universe did not care whether the righteous lived or died, an insistence that there was more to the accounting than what the visible world showed. You carry that map. Most people do, in some form, whether or not they are aware of it. The inherited picture of what happens after death, the judgment, the sorting, the rewarding and the punishing, exists in almost every culture, and in Western culture it carries the specific shape that was given to it by these specific texts, interpreted and elaborated through these specific centuries, and finally given its most vivid visual form by a Florentine poet who put his political enemies in the ice. What tonight gives you is not the destruction of the map, it is the knowledge of how the map was made. And knowing how the map was made is different from knowing that the territory is exactly what the map shows. Maps are always simplified. Maps are always made from a particular vantage point. Maps contain the assumptions of their makers and the limitations of what was knowable at the time they were made. This map was made by people who needed justice, who could not find it in the world they lived in, who extended the territory into a space beyond the visible because the visible space was not cooperating. That need does not make the map false, and knowing the history of the need does not require you to abandon whatever the map means to you. What it does offer is this: the oldest thing in the tradition, the oldest piece of scripture we have found, from the slope of the valley that became hell, is not a threat. It is not a warning. It is a blessing, carried in silver into the ground, to be with the dead in the dark. That is what the tradition started with. The blessing was there before the map was drawn. The map is a human construction, built by humans in distress, describing something that exceeded their language and required their best imagination. Whatever lies beyond the visible is not contained by the map. And whatever the silver scrolls intended when they carried the words into that chamber, whatever blessing they were meant to carry to the dead person beside them, or to the living person who might one day read them, that intention was older than the architecture and gentler than the architecture, and it survived. If tonight found something worth sitting with, if you learned something that shifted a question, or if the valley feels differently now than it did at the beginning, a quiet like before you go is always welcome. It's how the algorithm knows to keep these nights going, and it costs you nothing. The question from the beginning: where in the world are you tonight, and what hour marks where you are? Leave it below if you'd like. Someone is listening to this from somewhere I have never been, in a season I cannot quite imagine from here, at an hour that has its own particular quality of dark. That matters to me, the geography of the listeners, the map of the nights. I read those comments in the mornings and I think about each location. If you'd like more nights like this one, you can subscribe. It helps the algorithm find the people for whom this kind of night is exactly right. But if you've listened all the way to this moment, all the way through the valley and the chambers and the abyss and the accursed hollow in the Rock of Hinnom, then you have already done more than enough. You have walked the whole map. Let me bring you back to where we started. There is a park in Jerusalem where people walk their dogs. On a warm evening, the light falls in a particular way across the western slope. The way late afternoon light falls across limestone, when the sun is low and the rock has been holding the heat all day, and gives it back to the air in a way that you feel on your face rather than see. The trees on the slope cast long shadows across the footpath. The rock-cut tombs in the hillside are just shapes in the texture of the limestone to someone jogging past. Just the ordinary surface of the hill, doing what limestone does. And somewhere in that slope, set into the rock of Ge-Hinnom, the shoulder of the valley, the place where the ridge begins its descent, there is a chamber. The main chamber is empty now. It was excavated and documented in the 1970s, but below the main chamber, in the repository, there is the shape of where a ceiling fell, and in the space that the fallen ceiling protected for 2,600 years, two small cylinders of silver held words. Those words are in a museum now, in Jerusalem, in a climate-controlled case. You can stand in front of them on a Tuesday morning with other visitors walking past, people looking at other things in other cases, and what you are standing in front of is the oldest piece of scripture in the world. Not the oldest piece of warning, not the oldest piece of punishment architecture, not the oldest map of hell or chambers or abyss or accursed valleys. A blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. That is what was actually written there. That is what survived the Babylonian conquest, and the Persian period, and the Greek period, and the Maccabean wars, and the Roman destruction, and all the centuries of theology, and translation, and commentary, and poetry, and popular imagination. That is what was in the ground the whole time, waiting under the fallen ceiling, while everything above it was arguing about what the valley meant, and what lay beyond death, and how many circles there were, and whether the fire was eternal. A blessing in the valley, the oldest words of the Bible, in the ground of Gehenna. The valley can keep its name until morning. The map can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest.